Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. Today is International Day of Democracy, a timely moment to assess how democratic institutions are holding up around the world. In South Korea, the spotlight is on the Lee Jae Myung administration, which passed its 100-day marks last week. Elected through a fast-track vote in June, President Lee came into office pledging to restore democratic stability and pursue bold reforms of the prosecution, media, and judiciary. His message has centered on recovery and normalization, but with political polarization deepening and public trust in institutions under strain, key questions still remain. Is South Korea's democracy truly on a path to renewal, and what challenges lie ahead? For a deeper discussion on this, we invite Hans Schadl, Professor of Political Science at Yonsei University, to my right. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having me, Mok-yeon. Good to see you.
Good to see you. And also joining us to my left is Sujin Suzy Kim, Professor of Political Theory at Kyunghee University. Good to see you, Professor.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So let's start our discussion with Professor Schadl. So, like I've said, South Korea has gone through a turbulent democratic journey from the April 19th revolution to 2 presidential impeachments. So, in your assessment, how would you assess South Korea's, democratic standing at this point?
Sure, Mok-yeon. Well, I think of 3 words with that question. One is tested. Even as you point out, the people of South Korea have often had to fight to bring about democracy and then sustain it over the years and the decades. Another word is contested. I mean, every president generally does have to deal with quite a bit of opposition and criticism. And I just want to emphasize that democracies in practice are generally not the happiest of places all the time, at least not necessarily in the political arena. The political arena can typically be filled with accusations and controversies and a certain degree of discord. And that to an extent is normal. It can get carried away into bitter polarization. We can talk about the unhealthy circumstances that democracies can fall into. But a fair amount of disagreement pretty much goes hand in hand with strong democratic governance. And then the question is resilience. And I think we've seen quite a bit of resilience here in Korea from presidency to the next. And even when I look at the ongoing day-to-day stories now of the activities of the Lee Jae Myung administrations and the various reconfigurations of cabinet departments and ministries and so forth. I mean, there are some hot-button issues that go with that, but the hot-button issues aside, a lot of this is actually quite mundane, and it's what presidents do when they come in, is thinking about how to streamline and retool the government to better serve the people. It's not the first time in my 17 years here we've seen these kinds of reconfigurations. So I think even that alone is a suggestion that the country's democratic institutions carry on.
Right. Very important keywords. Tested, contested, and resilience.
Yes.
Right. Now let's take a look at a little bit of the recent developments, Professor Kim. So, how important was, the presidential election snap presidential election, we call it, last June, and the inauguration of the Lee administration in the context of democratic restoration? And also, could you evaluate the role of civil society in that process?
Sure. So overall, I think the snap election last June and the resulting inauguration of President Lee Jae Myung shows that democracy is alive and well for the most part in South Korea, despite the turmoil that followed the 2024 martial law crisis. So the 2024 martial law crisis has been criticized as a sort of a clear symptom of democratic backsliding in South Korea, with the executive making a sort of unilateral decision, almost by fiat, to declare martial law, which basically replaces the civilian government by military rule. And as a result of this sort of extreme nature, martial law is rarely invoked, except in times of utmost national emergency, such as a war, natural disaster, or a coup d'etat. So as a result, many South Koreans feared that this kind of sudden, unexpected martial law declaration by the former President Yoon foreshadowed something possibly as drastic as the Gwangju uprising in 1980. But to everyone's relief, this did not happen. And nonetheless, many citizens still see the 2024 martial law crisis as a kind of serious wake-up call to protect democracy with even greater vigilance and public participation. And I think this is in part part the reason why civil society played such a big role in bringing about the inauguration of the Lee Jae Myung administration and the resulting reforms that we are now seeing. And as a kind of example of the kind of a role of civil society in bringing about the Lee Jae Myung administration and its concomitant reforms, I think we can point to lots of popular protests against the martial law, as well as high voter turnout than usual, and direct as well as indirect political participation through social media.
Right. So as Professor Kim has mentioned, South Korea's democracy seems to be alive and well. Now, this coming despite, we have a shorter history of democracy than Western nations, of course. And now we are having this, we are being evaluated as a country with built up a relatively stable democratic institutions. So, Professor Shadow, what kind of factors and background conditions do you think was able to, contribute to this?
Right, that's a great topic, Mok-yeon. We could talk for about a half hour about that topic and go way back in time. But I guess I'd begin by pointing out that even during the decades of military dictatorships here, the government was actually building up some bureaucratic institutions that could set the stage for the country to have a fairly smooth democratic transition. I mean, after all, South Korea got the Olympics in 1988, Olympic Park being built during that time period. I mean, massive development projects that were coordinated. And there were some other factors here, I think, as well, that allowed the country to develop stable democratic institutions even after the democratic transition in 1987. The society built up a strong middle class, the big emphasis on education. There's an elite managerial and government civil servant class, many of whom earned university degrees outside the country. These days, Korean universities are competitive globally, but in the earlier years of the country's development, I think it was important that there were, people not just going to university here, but going overseas and learning more about stable democracy elsewhere and then bringing back best practices. So a lot of outside knowledge coming in. And aside from having a strong, highly educated middle class, I think there's a very strong adherence to norms in the political culture and an emphasis on shared goals that can be pursued in common, despite all the contestation. So in just some very broad brushstrokes, I think these are reasons that the democratic institutions have been able to remain largely resilient through the decades of testing that we have seen.
So those factors definitely could explain why we've managed to keep our democracy. Now, as for President Lee Jae Myung, in a press conference last week, he said his first 100 days were actually dedicated to recovery and normalization of democracy in the country. Professor Kim, what kind of efforts do you think the government has made in that regard, and how do you see those efforts actually contributing to the advancement of the nation's democracy?
I think that's a really important question. I think it's a question that all of us are thinking of at this moment as the reforms are taking place. So the Lee administration is making various efforts to restore democracy in the wake of the martial law crisis, but there are three sort of major areas of reform which I think is worth sort of paying particular attention to. So the first reform is the reform of the prosecution office or the prosecutorial office. So with respect to the prosecutorial reform, the Lee administration's main focus has been geared towards preventing excessive centralization of power in the prosecutor's hands. So the main worry that according to the Lee administration is that too much centralization of power in the public prosecutor's hands has brought about biased investigation and prosecution of innocent victims, especially those who happen to be allied with the opposition party. So one of the main sort of prosecutorial reforms along these lines concerns the separation of the criminal investigation procedure and the actual prosecution procedure. So this would effectively dissolve the existing public prosecution office, which has existed for 78 years. So this is a really radical sort of reform. And instead, these reforms would establish a new agency under the Ministry of Justice, which indicts serious crimes like insurrection, corruption, drug crimes, election law violation, and so on. And on the other hand, there would be established another new agency that takes charge of the criminal investigation process, which would be set up under the Ministry of Public Administration and Safety. So as we can plainly see, the separation of investigative and prosecutorial functions to these different government branches is meant to sort of reduce the concentration of power in the hands of the public prosecutor, and therefore bring about fair investigation and prosecution. Now, there are still lots of criticisms against this sort of prosecutorial reform, which, as I said before, is very radical in nature. So one of these criticisms is that, the entire sort of criminal investigation process would be weakened and it would be ineffective because a lot of the prosecutors, because of the dissolution of the prosecutorial office, they would now have to either go to the Ministry of Justice or the Ministry of Public Administration, but then they would be reluctant to do so for various kinds of reasons. And again, this has to do with the lack of the prosecutor's right to conduct supplementary investigation, which would again deprive the prosecutor of rights to conduct further investigations, which again, according to existing prosecutors, is very important for a thorough and just investigation into criminal cases. So there has been lots of these criticisms, and another sort of criticism that might be worth mentioning is that especially those from the opposition party see these kinds of prosecutorial reforms as a form of political retaliation against the former President Yoon's party, the People Power Party. And these worries have been receiving more attention as a result of the closing down of the Facebook account of a lawyer named Kim Jong-min, who heavily criticized the Lee administration's prosecutorial reform. So these are some of the things worth paying attention to. And the second reform that has been highlighted is obviously the reform of the judiciary. So primarily, the Lee administration has proposed to institute a special tribunal for the insurrection of former President Yoon. And many people see this as a kind of unconstitutional move, a threat to the independence of the judiciary from the legislative branch, and therefore a threat to democracy itself. And this is because, the prevention of tyranny crucially depends upon a clear separation of powers between the three different branches of government, so the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. Now, with this kind of institution of a special tribunal for the insurrection, the judiciary essentially collapses into the legislature, which in its current state is dominated by the ruling Democratic Party. So then there would be really no separation of powers, and it would be hard to avoid a decline in South Korean democracy as a result. And another judicial reform that I really need to point out here is to expand the Supreme Court judiciary from its current 14 members to 30 members and include people from various underrepresented groups, such as women, lawyers, as well as citizens who are not legal professionals. So again, this is a very sort of radical reform proposal. So the aim of expanding the judiciary in this manner is to give everyone a substantive right to a fair trial, both because the existing judiciary is too small to handle over 4,000 cases per year, and members of the existing judiciary is not representative of all the diverse groups within South Korea. But again, these kinds of judicial reform proposals have faced strong criticisms. So one is that many people worry that expanding the judiciary to include additional members appointed directly by the executive, that is by the president, will compromise the independence of the judiciary from the executive. And one law professor actually recently pointed out that these reforms are similar to the historical court of the Star Chamber in the 15th to 17th century England, which degenerated into a device that was used to suppress political opposition to royal policies. So again, these proposed reforms still raise worries about the independence of the judiciary. Because determining the constitutionality of a statute or policy will then, after these reforms, depend on the will of the majority. So this raises worries about the tyranny of the majority and so forth. There are media reforms that are also worth mentioning, but because of lack of time, I'll just skip over that. Right. But one of the media reforms is the EDS law reform. And yeah, so that's probably worth mentioning. Yeah.
So we're seeing a lot of reforms, though there's some of them are being criticized. The voice of criticism there still are, but definitely these reforms are aimed to distribute the power within
Exactly.
The branches. Now, amid these reforms, there have been also some threats that we're seeing in terms of Korean democracy. Professor Shuttle, could you name us for some of them?
Right, Mok-yeon. First thing I want to say, and I just want to pick up on an important point that Professor Kim just made about retribution. And many democracies, South Korea included, as control of the government, or at least control of the executive branch, goes from one party to the next, that country can fall into a pattern in which whenever a different party gets its turn in power, corruption cases and other accusations can go against the opposition party. So it almost seems like a cycle of retribution from one party to the next. And then the citizenry is discontented as a result, so they throw one set of bums out only for another set of bums to come in that then prosecutes the previous set of bums. And that can lead to an erosion in public confidence eventually, in a sense that the system isn't working anymore. It's very important for President Lee Jae Myung, I think. And again, I'm an American, I don't want to be telling another country what to do, but it's important for any president to create an environment when a previous president is going through a criminal trial, to make it clear that the trial is not about retribution, but it's about the rule of law, and it's about adherence to constitutional norms and protecting constitutional standards when a previous office holder has violated those standards. So connecting the specific case at hand with some general principles. And somehow I think the Lee Jae Myung administration and the National Assembly, the DP, since they are in power in both branches right now, the executive and the legislative branch, and that happens more often in Korea than a lot of other countries because there's only a single chamber legislature here. That party in power has to make it very clear that this is about the integrity of the system itself. It's not about personalities or going after previous office holders. That's one big thing. Another threat that all democracies around the world really are dealing with right now in the social media age, and we're seeing it here in Korea, is that the citizenry also increasingly doesn't share the same basis of information for having the truth. The understanding of the citizenry as to what the truth might be is not even necessarily the same thing. It's not like everybody now goes home at night and watches the network news programs, which have all been vetted by professional journalists and the most important agendas are presented to the public. Now, as we all well know, people go into their little social media spaces or their biased, opinionated news programs, whichever direction they go. That sets up different versions of reality. And one version of reality that we've been seeing here in Korea is the version that is contesting the outcome or contesting the integrity of the presidential election in June. Just a week and a half ago, there was a conference out in Ilsan at which many activists from what we would probably classify as radical right, with activists from the U.S. side, some of them coming over in person, some of them speaking virtually through high-tech platforms. Steve Bannon, one of President Donald Trump's key advisors over the years, was telling the Korean people that their election was stolen. Charlie Kirk, who tragically was just killed a few days after his visit here, was also raising questions about whether the CCP is somehow controlling Korean politics. There need to be strong efforts by really all the political parties to separate truth from fiction. And all of us as a political culture, and this includes universities and schools and so forth, we need to create the environments where citizens can receive information that's accurate and trustworthy, and you can still see all sides of an issue and all interpretations of the issue. But at the end of the day, fact-finding and truth-telling have to be two imperatives that carry the day.
Definitely. Now, we are aware that historically, South Korea's democracy has been shaped by mass civic engagement from the May 18th movement to, candlelight protests. But lately, we're seeing signs of political fatigue and declining trust among the public. So what kind of measures could be needed to ensure sustainable civic participation, Professor Kim?
Again, I think that's a really important question. So just to continue what Professor Hans Schottel has just mentioned, I think we do need to provide equal access to reliable sources of information to various groups and demographics within the South Korean citizenry. And political parties really need to create an environment where truth and falsity is clearly separated. So again, that might have something to do with the media reforms that are going on right now. And secondly, there needs to be an increased effort to educate citizens about their rights and responsibilities in the political decision-making process, as well as making it easier for ordinary citizens to access information about how to participate in these government decision-making processes. Because surprisingly, a lot of citizens are ignorant about how they can actually participate in the decision-making process regarding different kinds of policies and so on. And finally, I think there needs to be a shift in the power dynamics between citizens and elected officials. And this can be achieved, for instance, by creating more opportunities for citizens to engage in the actual decision-making process and ensuring that their voices are heard and considered. And in turn, elected officials also need to be held accountable for their actions and decisions, which can be achieved by implementing mechanisms for citizen feedback and evaluation of their performance.
Mm-hmm. So this democracy, K-democracy, we need some kind of tips from other countries as well. As we draw, global comparisons, the U.S. and European nations are also grappling with political polarization that we've mentioned a while ago. Professor Schottel, are there any notable integration strategies that we could, learn from them and adopt?
Well, when we're looking overseas at North America and Europe, of course, a lot of the polarization that those countries are struggling with, Mok-yeon, has to do with immigration and the difficulty that many societies that aim to be multi-ethnic, multicultural democracies actually run into as they try to carry that out. One hard lesson that's been learned in Europe and even in Northern European countries, I'm thinking of Sweden as an example, and Germany as well. Many countries have taken in very large numbers of immigrants and refugees in very short periods of time, so quickly that the economic opportunity is not there for the immigrants that are coming in, or the challenges of these immigrants settling in, learning the language, getting their kids in the schools, helping their kids get educated. All the issues that go with helping immigrants work their way into the middle class. It's just been too much too fast too soon, and it's created backlashes, some of which we've seen spilling into election decisions and even bitter protests, such as what we saw in the streets of London this past weekend. The longer trajectory suggests that for immigration to really work well in societies that aspire to be multi-ethnic and multicultural, that the tools need to be given both to the immigrant population to settle in, work their way into the middle class. Educational opportunities, economic opportunities are really important. And the native population has to figure out how to adjust, and political leaders need to guide the native population. The native population just can't stay the same and take in immigrant population. The native population also has to change and adjust itself and become more attuned to a multicultural society. And this is a decades, even centuries long endeavor. So this is the endeavor that Korea will be going into, especially as its birth rate declines in the coming years. Already an issue that we're dealing with in society. For the Korean society to regenerate, it likely will be in a form that's somewhat more multi-ethnic than what we've had over the decades. So there's a lot to learn from and to try to work with going forward.
Mm-hmm. So among that, what kind of measures could South Korea actually put into, context, you think?
Well, a lot of the same measures that the local population is concerned about. Good jobs for young adults, regardless of one's background. Some changes to the educational system that might make it easier for international residents to work their way through the Korean educational system. Less stress for Korean high school students as well. More opportunity, more social welfare programs for new moms to help raise families. A lot of the kinds of policies that pretty much everybody supports and both parties support. I think we've talked about this in the aftermath of the election, that nevertheless are very hard for presidents and parliaments to deliver because they get bogged down in the inter-party rivalries. I'd love to see in this country if both the DP and the PPP can get on the same page for some of these issues and try to take the country in a direction where it could continue to be a kind of role model for other democracies around the world.
Right. We all hope for that. So let's hope that day will come someday. But as for now, we'll have to conclude our discussion here at this point. Thank you so much for your insights, Professor Schottel.
Thank you again for having me, Mok-yeon. Pleasure.
Thank you. And Professor Kim, of course.
Thank you again for having me.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Till then, stay informed and engaged.